One.
Well, we're live. Welcome to the Gazette's Pints Politics. Knock on wood, this is our last virtual edition. We're going to be back in person at Cedar Ridge Winery on August 26th for a kind of limited attendance event, but we'll have more details on that at the end of the program here. But tonight we've got a great panel lined up and a special guest. Sarah Watson is the Bettendorf, East Moline, and Silvis reporter for the Quad City Times, covering local government and news. She graduated from the University of Iowa, where she was editor-in-chief of the Daily Iowan student newspaper. And of special interest to us, she interned at the Gazette last summer, so we got to spend some more concentrated time with her then. So thanks so much for joining us, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's going to be good here. So tonight we're missing Adam Sullivan, who's taken some time off. We have our regulars, Todd Dorman, Gazette's Insights and Opinion editor. He's got the corn behind him. And James Lynch, the Gazette political reporter. Thanks for being here.
You bet.
As usual, we'll start with national news, followed by state and local politics. If you have questions, submit them, and I think they can just submit them in the chat, and we'll work them into our hour-long conversation. We've got a few of them already that came in today, and those we'll get them into the program. So I wanted to just start off today. President Biden said he has reached a bipartisan deal on a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package. I don't think details are out yet, but it seems to be promising that there's been this compromise reached between Democrats and Republicans. I wanted to just ask the panel, is infrastructure something maybe people were thought to be able to agree on a little more than, say, like border policy or something else?
Yeah, I think that's been the feeling from the beginning, is that infrastructure is something that a broad spectrum of members of Congress could agree on, that there's generally pretty broad support among the public for spending on infrastructure. It's very cliche to say there's no Republican pothole and no Democratic pothole, but I think voters see the truth in that, and also that infrastructure is one of those things that, for the most part, we can see when it needs improvement. So, I think it's easier to reach agreement on that. Finding agreement on how to pay for it might not be as easy.
Well, it sounds like, you've got this group of 10, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats. They've got a deal. I think there's like $579 million of this overall total that's new money for infrastructure. So with 5 Republicans, that still leaves you short of the 60 votes you need to break a filibuster. And also you're going to have some concerns from progressive Democrats that this package doesn't include climate change and some of the other issues that they care about. The president's made promises that he'll pass a second bill using reconciliation, probably with the votes of only Democrats. So we'll see, if progressives in the House are willing to go along with this deal, and if they can scratch together enough Republicans to pass it. But as we've seen with several bills so far this year, breaking the filibuster is difficult, and they don't have the votes in the Democratic caucus to reform or eliminate the filibuster. So this may get stuck along with some of the other items on the president's to-do list.
Yeah, I'll just say in my new position covering East Moline and Bettendorf, a lot of the things that I've been covering are about infrastructure, and that's something that a lot of residents really care about. Those are some of our most read stories, are about new projects going on. So that's definitely something that people really are reading about and are caring about. So back to the question about like why this might be easier to agree on, it definitely, everybody wants to see improved roads and streets and bridges to drive on and get to work on time. And that's the like nuts and bolts of the government. But yeah, I'd also agree, like it's a significantly scaled back bill from what was originally proposed, and Biden has said that he's not going to sign a bill unless it is accompanied by another bill with more of his proposals related to his climate agenda and things. So even if they do get enough votes, if they can't rustle up the rest of the votes for another piece of his agenda. I mean, he'll have to make that decision of whether they'll continue to go forward with this scaled back bill or to sacrifice that part of his agenda.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of it's in, just got to see how it plays out. Were you going to add something, Jim?
Well, I was just going to say that already there's some disagreement over whether or not the federal gas tax should be raised to pay for infrastructure. And there's a proposal to index it to inflation so they don't have to have this argument about raising the gas tax. I think it's been maybe 15, 20 years since they've raised the federal gas tax. And it's whenever you talk about raising a tax, it's very hard to do. And the gas tax is one of those that I think taxpayers see it more easily because they pay it every time they go to the gas station. But if they don't raise that tax, it's going to come from some taxes somewhere else. And it sort of makes sense that if you're going to improve roads and bridges and streets and those sorts of infrastructures, then pay for it with the motor fuel tax.
Yeah, and that does make sense. Although, the time to raise the gas tax is when gas prices are low, and certainly gas prices aren't low right now. So it's sort of layering that on at this point is probably going to be really unpopular. So I think the president sort of ruled it out. I'm sure Republicans were sad to hear that because they would like to take that issue into the campaign, even though, like you say, it makes total sense to use a gas tax to pay for the road infrastructure and bridges. And it hasn't been raised. I think has it been 20 years or some really long period like that?
Of course, Republicans say that Biden raised gas prices, so I suppose he can lower them now if he wants to get a gas tax passed.
He does have that power, as do all presidents.
Exactly.
So speaking, we were kind of touching on some other subjects that maybe are a little bit more difficult to agree on. Governor Reynolds announced today she's going to send state patrol troopers to the U.S.-Mexico border in response to requests from the governors of Arizona and Texas. A question from one of our audience members. In her reasoning for this, Governor Reynolds mentioned drug traffic, coming up from Mexico. And I mean, that's not new. We've, the fact checker has checked that. I mean, that the flow of drugs it's perennially probably come from Mexico, but it's definitely not a new thing. So what do you think the troopers are going to do down there? And does that leave Iowa, vulnerable with, 20 some troopers gone?
Well, I think what they're going to do is they're going to provide some nice political optics for the governor to, claim that she's doing something about the so-called border crisis, which is obviously an argument that Republicans have been making and a cudgel that they've used to bash the president a lot lately. This is sort of a political gesture. I don't think, is it 25 troopers that they're sending or something along those lines? I don't believe that's going to make a huge practical dent in, the security that's needed at the border. But and at one point the governor said this wasn't our problem. So I guess now it is our problem. But the refugee children that are the unaccompanied children that are being held in shelters and things that the president and the Biden administration asked states to help with that. She didn't want to help with that, but she is willing to send troopers to the border.
I'll bet the troopers would feel better about it if she sent them there in January rather than July or August.
Right. Yeah. Well, maybe there's speeding going on down there. I don't know. I see these families waiting across the river with all their belongings. They don't seem to be going particularly fast. So I'm not sure the highway patrol is the right unit to send down there. But the governor has this authority, and she's obviously using it.
We already have Iowa National Guard members down deployed to the border. So I guess we're expanding our reach, the power of Iowa.
The timing too, I think, is interesting, just with announcements for the governor's race on the Democratic side. Just speaking back to it being more of a political PR move, that might take away some attention from some of the Democratic candidates who have announced. And then also, I don't know if this is really super new, but I remember at least back in May, she was going on Fox News quite a bit to try to make her message or, pitch the message to a national audience that Iowa was, doing great with COVID. And this immigration is definitely a wedge issue nationwide that a lot of people can understand. And, people in Iowa are watching Fox News from their homes and things. So I don't know that she has anything planned, but I think that this is something that she seems to be focused on is nationwide issues that everybody can relate to.
Yeah, I think Sarah's right. She's going to clearly run a nationalized campaign for governor. It's not going to be sort of, there will be rural broadband and some of these things that are the Iowa issues that she continues to sort of talk about, but it's going to be, don't elect Democrats because of this national immigration problem or this, creeping socialism that's taking over everything. And she's going to run on, transgender sports, things like that are these national Fox News, high ratings sort of issues. And she's going to sort of bring those to Iowa and argue that she's the best to deal with this, even though Iowa's not close to the border and isn't always completely connected to all these issues. It's the Republican base cares about them. So she's going to hammer them and hammer Democrats.
I think it'll be part of the dialogue or the narrative that, the Biden administration can't solve the issue on the border. So we have to send our National Guard men and women, and we have to send our state troopers down there to help stem the flow of illegal immigrants, who are bringing drugs, who are committing crimes, who, go down the list of all the things they do, in addition to taking a lot of low-paying jobs that apparently Iowans don't want. So it'll be part of that narrative that Republican governors have to step up and do what the Biden-Harris administration refuses to do or can't do.
Well, there's sort of that.
Go ahead, Todd.
Go ahead. I was gonna say it's always a sort of two-sided immigration issue with Republicans. You've got Republicans who are sort of, fond, especially Donald Trump, fond of demonizing immigrants, talking about how they're criminals and it makes us less safe. But at the same time, the governor will take donations and support from agricultural interests that need that labor, that, that's the places that these folks will work. So it's, hammer the immigrants, but don't hammer the large agribusinesses that give them jobs. And that's, it strikes some people as hypocritical, but it strikes me as being hypocritical, but it's, not something that the Republicans like to talk about.
I was thinking about, after the derecho, there was the question about whether the National Guard should come to Cedar Rapids, and then whether the National Guard, the National Guard, whether they were that helpful when they came. And I remember someone telling me that if you haven't asked for a resource and it arrives, it can almost be kind of a burden because you have to put this resource to use. And I'm wondering whether the Border Patrol agents having to maybe explain to state troopers from other states, like how to do what they need them to do, how that could almost potentially be a burden too.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wanted to ask too, there's some movement, I guess, this week, the For the People Act, a Democratic proposal that would have expanded access to voting and, to some extent, it counteracted restrictions in some states, failed in the US Senate. Does that mean reform is dead? Are Democrats going to keep pushing at that point?
Well, Democratic leader, Senate leader Chuck Schumer said he's going to keep pushing it, but Senator Chuck Grassley this week said it's dead and it ought to be dead. So they're not going to get any more support out of Republicans, I don't think, as hard as they push it. There were some good ideas in this bill, ending partisan gerrymandering, for example. But it seemed like some of the provisions were a Democratic power grab, and that's something both parties do when they can. And they didn't necessarily improve the way states conduct their elections. It would have, as you said, Erin, sort of counteracted some of the restrictions that state legislators have enacted in the past year or two. But some of those provisions have never really had much support, widespread support for, I'm thinking of, for example, public financing of campaigns. That's an idea that's been around a long time, but has never reached a level of a majority in Congress have been willing to support that. So I think it'll be a talking point. I don't really expect more action on this, but it'll be a good issue to take into the 2022 campaigns.
Well, and there's a second, less broad bill that basically returns to some of the Voting Rights Act provisions that required states to submit their potential changes in the way they regulate voting to the Department of Justice. But even that bill doesn't have much of a chance. I mean, as long as Democrats are content to leave the filibuster in place, none of this is going to happen. And I mean, we'll see going forward how much these state changes, impact voting. But there are real fears among Democrats that some of the provisions in some states that allow the legislature to take a much larger role in deciding, in certifying elections and putting, political appointees on some of these boards that certify, whether, there's always this talk whether that this stuff had been in place, last year, would they have been able to overturn results that favored Biden, and would this have changed the outcome of the election? I mean, there are some real fears about that. There are folks that say that that's not true. It's that's not going to happen, that these are alarmists, but I mean, it's hard to take a chance on that. So I think the more modest bill, at the very least, providing some oversight of some of these state election law changes would be good. But again, until, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema and other moderate Democrats are willing to, either scrap or reform the filibuster in some way, this stuff is never going to come to a final vote.
Yeah, and when this bill was first written by House Democrats in 2019, it was when the Senate was still controlled by Republicans, and so it was this giant bill of almost just what would be an ideal list of for Democrats voting changes, and so that trying to make it through to become laws, like not the pared down proposal, was probably a pretty difficult sell for Republicans, since it was pretty big, even though there was the other, the pared down one, but that wasn't run through the Senate like this one was.
Yeah, and well, one provision in the For the People Act would make every state have basically a redistricting process like Iowa does, which would be a good idea, but unfortunately that isn't going to happen. I mean, both parties engage in gerrymandering, but I think Republicans have done a much better job in recent years of utilizing some pretty, remarkable technology that gets down into precincts and draws crazy lines, and they've done a better job with it and have used that to their advantage. I mean, the downside of that, regardless of which party, is that you end up with districts that aren't competitive. So primaries are the really only competitive election, which leads to more polarization. And I mean, at least in Iowa, as red as we are, I mean, there are at least 2 congressional districts currently held by Republicans, one who won by 6 votes, that are still fairly competitive. And that's because we draw maps based on population and sort of neutral factors rather than, who has the most votes. And we pick the politicians, we don't let the politicians pick the voters.
And when you say good at gerrymandering, you mean that it's I mean, that's not a good practice, obviously.
No, I mean, it's like Wisconsin's a good example. I mean, they are a state that voted for Biden. I think, generally they're pretty purple, but their legislature is extremely red because they were able to draw districts that gave them a remarkable partisan advantage in those races, sort of, districts that follow highways. And I mean, their map is pretty crazy to look at.
Changing gears a little bit, most states, including Iowa, have completely relaxed COVID-19 restrictions, and the infection rates are down dramatically. I think on Wednesday, the state's 7-day average was 80 new cases and 2 deaths. But there are some pretty kind of disturbing reports out of Missouri and other pockets, which, Missouri's our southern neighbor, about ICUs filling up again and the different variants appearing. And they think that it's taking hold among, maybe 40-year-olds who have not been vaccinated. In Iowa, some counties, I think some of the border counties with Missouri have vaccination rates lower than 30%. It makes me a little worried. How are we going to be sure to keep COVID on the run here?
Unfortunately, it appears we're not keeping it on the run. Iowa started off pretty good with the vaccination rates running ahead of the national average for a number of weeks, but it seems to have stalled out now. I think we're still at somewhere less than 50% vaccinated, which is far below what we need for herd immunity. And it seems unlikely we're going to get to the 70% goal that President Biden set for July 4th. And now we're hearing the COVID we could see a resurgence in the fall if we don't reach herd immunity. And that right now, that looks unlikely. It seems like the state especially should be doing more to incentivize people getting shots. There are a lot of reluctant folks, whether it's, lottery prizes, free tuition for people who want to go to college, maybe a dinner with the governor as incentives to get shots in arms.
Well, and if the unfortunate incentive may be if this Delta variant begins to circulate in Iowa and make people sick, that might prompt some people to have second thoughts about not getting vaccinated. But I think what we're going to see is we're going to see pockets of problems. We're going to see places or regions where they haven't been vaccinated in high numbers that are going to see a resurgence of the disease, whereas in maybe your urban centers and places that have had higher, counties that have had higher vaccination rates, you'll see less of a problem. So it's, we looked like we were headed towards sort of a knockout, and now there's a lot more uncertainty than there was. And I don't expect, the Governor Reynolds' administration to change much with regard to COVID precautions, because they've been in favor of opening things up and keeping them open. But it'll be interesting to see if we do, as Erin said, those rural border counties with Missouri that have such low rates, if we start to see case spikes in those areas, that'll certainly be a wake-up call for some folks who didn't get vaccinated.
I think it'll be interesting too to see when the final stamp of approval comes for these vaccines. So right now it's under emergency use authorization, and so once it gets that final stamp of approval from the FDA, and I think employers will feel more comfortable requiring the vaccine, at least in the area in the Quad Cities. Hospitals, the 2 main hospital networks, are not requiring their employees to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And I'm not sure exactly what it would be in Cedar Rapids or Des Moines, but even though hospitals can, there is that ruling that hospitals can require their employees to get vaccinated. And so they were speculating that they were holding, or I was talking with the county health department official who was speculating that, oh, they may just be holding off until there's that final stamp of approval. And then they're like, okay, we feel good to go to require this like we require the flu vaccine. So I think hopefully before fall, the vaccine would have that final stamp of approval and would build more confidence in the vaccine, or at least confidence for employers to require it.
I think about, I know there's some people who have argued against the, prizes and, lotteries and freebies, saying, well, do we really want to get in a pattern of incentivizing people to do something that's for their own public health? But I feel like you may decide to get the vaccine because of that, but then once you've gotten it, you're probably going to get it again, and you're probably going to be more on board with that decision because that's the decision you made. And I feel like if we can nudge it a little higher with those freebies, it might be worth it. And a lot of counties in Iowa have done that.
I thought that when they lowered the age down to 17, and then I think it's down to 12 now, 12 and up, that might encourage, we might see more people getting the vaccine as their kids said, hey, I want to get vaccinated, and that would encourage the parents. I don't think the numbers don't seem to indicate that's happening here in Iowa, which is really unfortunate, that we can't, do it as a family. It seems like a pro-family sort of activity that would be good for the family, for the community, but the numbers don't seem to indicate that.
Well, Sarah, I wanted to turn to you. So you moved from being editor-in-chief of the Daily Iowan, which is a state and national award-winning newspaper, to being a daily news reporter. I wondered how that transition's been so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really fun. The Daily Iowan is definitely a full-time gig along with being a full-time student. So I've really enjoyed learning a new area and then being able to go home and reset a little bit before coming back in and going back into work, since I don't have to do classes on top of reporting. And so I really miss all my friends at the Daily Iowan, and miss talking about stories and getting excited about assignments and things going on in the University of Iowa. But now I have a new area to get to know, and in the position as editor, it was very much a mentoring role or directing traffic. And so now I'm getting to see more people face to face now that there's not like the concern about COVID, and getting to develop relationships on my beat in East Moline and Bettendorf has been really fun. So I miss the Daily Iowan so much, but I'm so happy to be in an area nearby where I grew up and get back on the ground again and talk to people.
And as you mentioned, you've been writing a number of stories about infrastructure. I saw you've written about water main breaks, kind of new development, the housing market in the Quad Cities. What other topics are you hoping to dig into?
Yeah, so I really like reporting on infrastructure. It affects everyone. And something that I find really interesting is that there's a lot of concerns about flooding and flood prevention that's going on here. So I definitely want to dig into that more, and environmental effects of agriculture and companies here on our natural resources, because the Quad Cities, at least in their strategic plans, they really want to take advantage of the river, and that's their main resource for attracting people to the area. And so, we obviously want to preserve that then. And so I want to dig into some more like environmental policy type stories.
Definitely a good topic statewide with climate change upon us. We've talked before on Pints and Politics about Chuck Grassley's future in the U.S. Senate. The New Hartford Republican hasn't said whether he will seek an 8th term, but this week the Iowa poll showed 64% of Iowans surveyed think it's time for him to move on or for someone else to, besides Grassley, to represent Iowa. James, I think you talked with Senator Grassley about this. What do you have to say?
What's interesting, Erin, is that that 64% includes 1 in 3 Republicans, which I'm guessing is the number of Republicans who are younger than 40 and have had Chuck Grassley as their senator their entire lives. But yeah, I talked to Grassley this week, and we asked him about those poll numbers and what that might mean for his 8th term, or his bid for an 8th term. He's still saying he'll announce in September, October, no later than November. He said a year is enough to campaign. And I suppose that's true when you've been running for office since 1959. A year is long enough. And he said he's aware of the polls, but he's not really paying attention to them. He's concentrating on his job rather than on the polls. And he said he's, at his, talks about his 99 county meetings and how this issue comes up sometimes and people advise him on whether he should run or not. And he says he's listening to them more than he's, listening to the polls about whether he should run for re-election or whether he should even be a candidate.
Well, what are they going to tell him? If you're talking to someone face to face, are you going to tell them that you don't want them to run? I don't know. That seems like that's.
I think some people have told him that, considering maybe not so much the length of time that he's been there, but at his age, sort of at least questioning whether he wants to run for another term and whether someone his age should. And that's an issue that he's addressed too, is that he's talked about, if he feels like he's in good health and can serve another 6-year term, that will be a factor in his decision. I'll say again that the longer he waits to make his decision, I think probably means that he is running again rather than in October or November saying, oh, I'm not going to run. Let's have a free for all to see who's going to succeed me, because there will be a lot of candidates in that case.
Yeah, I think he's going to run because I think his party nationally needs him to hold down that seat. They don't need another seat to worry about as they try to, rebuild a Senate majority. That poll, I mean, it's interesting, but I think it's one of those polls. It's like 64% of people say they want someone else, but given Grassley, they'll probably still vote for him over a Democrat. So, as far as asking about someone running when they don't have an opponent is a lot different than polling, Chuck Grassley versus Abby Finkenauer or something like that. I think that poll would look a lot different. But that said, I agree with James that, if he waits until November, that means he's going to run. In fact, I think if he wasn't going to run, he probably would have announced that by now, because Republican candidates are going to need to raise quite a bit of money and do a lot of campaigning to build, unless they have someone else in mind, which I can't, imagine necessarily who that would be.
Well, and I think about, when Tom Harkin decided not to seek another term back in 2014, he announced early in the year, I think it was February, when he announced that he wasn't seeking in February of 2013, that he wasn't going to seek another term. So there was time for the process to work. Democrats perhaps didn't take advantage of that time and settled on a candidate rather quickly, and that didn't work out real well. So yeah, I agree with Todd that I think it's highly likely that Chuck Grassley is running for an 8th term.
So can one of you catch us up about which candidates are declared so far who've said they're running for Senate?
Well, Republican State Senator Jim Carlin of Sioux City has said he's running, regardless of whether Grassley runs or not. No other Republican has indicated they're running, but if Grassley doesn't run, I think there'll be at least a handful, maybe 2 handfuls or more Republicans who will consider that race and get into it. On the Democratic side, there are a number of people sort of waiting in the wings. State Auditor Rob Sand, who was on a lot of people's lists, has said he won't run for the Senate. Dave Mulbauer, a Western Iowa cattle farmer, has announced he's been out around the state meeting with Democrats. Beyond that, it's a lot of the names we've been hearing ever since 2020, Abby Finkenauer, Michael Franken, Teresa Greenfield, and many, many more. And just as I said, there'd be a lot of Republican candidates if Grassley doesn't run. I think the Democratic field would be large too if he opts out of this race. If he runs for another term, I wouldn't expect too many Democrats to run against him, but I'm sure there will be at least one or two or three that will make a run at him.
So in Iowa's first district for the U.S. House, it looks like we could have what James had called the battle of the anchors. Who are we talking about here, and what would that look like?
Well, we're talking about the incumbent, Representative Ashley Hinson from Marion, and State Senator Liz Mathis from Hiawatha. They're former co-workers. They're both TV news anchors. So if Liz Mathis runs, it would pit two smart, articulate, well-known candidates against each other. They'll have plenty of money, and probably their TV ads will be better than most congressional campaigns that we've seen in recent years. And I would say incumbents always have the edge. That being said, Ashley Hinson defeated an incumbent to get to Congress. So I think a question on the minds of both Democrats and Republicans I talked to is what the first district is going to look like after redistricting. If it loses a couple of rural red counties, a Democratic pickup would be easier. On the other hand, if the first adds a few of those red counties, perhaps from the current fourth district, Hinson would be safer. And with two suburban Cedar Rapids candidates facing off, the Democratic advantage in Lynn County could come into play to Liz Mathis' advantage.
A question from John Hale, an audience member. He wonders about the odds of a Democratic challenger. He mentioned specifically Roz Smith, a Democrat from Waterloo, state representative from Waterloo, whether any of these Democratic challengers have a chance against Governor Kim Reynolds.
Well, I would say yes, to the extent that I think in 2018, Kim Reynolds beat Fred Hovell, Sir Frederick. She won fairly narrowly as Iowa gubernatorial elections go. I think it was less than, or right around 3 percentage points, maybe a couple tenths of a percent more or less. So, looking at that, yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible if Democrats pick a strong candidate, they can challenge her. But a lot will depend on what happens in the primary. Roz Smith is in. He's a well-regarded state lawmaker from Waterloo, as you mentioned. There are lots of people, again, as with the Senate race, talking about running. Rob Sand, and I'm sure there are lawmakers, and does Michael Franken run for Senate or governor? Some of these folks are interchangeable. Cindy Axne has said she's open to running for multiple offices. So I think it could be a competitive gubernatorial election. I mean, the history of the party out of the White House doing well in a midterm factors into that, but I don't know, with so many things that we used to rely on as being a predictive normal, we can't rely on them anymore because everything is so volatile. But I mean, there are issues for Democrats to run against, against Governor Reynolds. I mean, there are things that they can argue have not gone so well. So I'm hoping we could see a competitive gubernatorial election, because that's a lot more interesting than one that's not, obviously.
Yeah, I would think could be competitive. You look at recent electoral history, and as Todd mentioned, Governor Reynolds was reelected or elected in 2018 by a few percentage points. Then you look at 2020 and Donald Trump carries the state by 8 or 9 percentage points. It looks like it should be a safe state, a safe seat for Republicans. But when you look at those Iowa poll numbers, there are some things in there that might worry Republicans. Fewer than 50% of the voters approved of what Reynolds is doing in terms of criminal justice and education, which was surprising to me. But I think it shows the sort of the attitudes of parents about opening schools and some of the concerns about the charter school legislation that was passed this year. So I think there are some openings for Democrats, but she's playing to the base. I think all her decisions, whether it's on COVID or sending the national or the state troopers to the border, probably have been poll tested, and the results have been in her favor.
Yeah, she's also below 50% with independents, which has got to give them a little bit of concern. I mean, the wild card really is sort of COVID to some extent, because it's just, if we continue, in steady progress toward ending the pandemic, will voters still want to talk about COVID next, the middle of next year? If the Delta variant spikes and things don't go as well, I mean, will that continue to be an issue? I think that's kind of an open question. Democrats have been very critical of her response. The Iowa poll showed that most Iowans don't necessarily agree with them, but I still think there are things within her management of the pandemic that could be used as arguments, basically arguments against re-electing her. But will that still be an issue next year? It's hard to say.
Yeah, that's something that I would think about too, that whether people have a short memory when it comes to the pandemic, or whether it's going to be a central issue, or if people just kind of want to be done with it. And it's interesting watching Reynolds on her national appearances on Fox News. I mean, she really uses the pandemic as a, wow, look at what Iowa did. We had kids in schools the whole year, and sent back some federal money because we didn't need it. So she's really touting her response to the pandemic as a positive thing. So I wonder too if it might just come down to how voters viewed the pandemic, whether they viewed it as a real threat or whether they viewed it as something that wasn't really a threat.
And she sent some pandemic money back, but she's going to use some of it for a advertising campaign to promote the state. So that's an interesting decision, I think.
Well, it's interesting, as Sarah was saying, that the governor has really touted the economic success of her policies. However, if you look at Iowa's economy, it's not creating many jobs. We're not growing. And so that campaign, to attract people to Iowa might be necessary. I don't know that that's pandemic related, and whether those funds, it's appropriate to use them for, advertising. Hey, come to a place where, pandemics be damned. We show up for work and school and those sorts of things. But the other part of what I wanted to get to was that if we see a resurgence of the pandemic and it really affects the economy, it could be very hard on her reelection campaign, because she, like Sarah said, she's really been touting the success of her policies and keeping the Iowa economy open. That may come back to bite her.
Well, and she's declared early victory before during the pandemic. I mean, there was a point in the middle of last year where she declared that Iowa was recovered, and of course the worst of the pandemic hadn't happened yet. That hit in November, December, and January. So yeah, she's got a track record of hanging the mission accomplished banner maybe before it was prudent to do so.
Governor Reynolds last week signed the Back the Blue legislation that would add legal protection for law enforcement officers and increase penalties for some protest-related offenses. So in her condition of the state address in January, February, whenever that was, she had promised other police reforms. Do you think we'll see any of that, kind of like a ban on chokehold, some other things?
No. The legislators didn't seem too interested in that. You know, they a lot of them felt they went far enough with the restrictions on chokeholds in the Toward a More Perfect Union bill that they unanimously approved back in 2020. You know, the governor called for some movement on racial profiling. It didn't go anywhere in this most recent session. So no, I don't think we're going to see that. There certainly weren't any indications that there was support for going down the taking away qualified immunity, banning chokeholds, doing something about racial profiling. And people will say that, well, we were so focused on sort of economic issues, but I don't think that was the reason that they didn't go do anything on those other issues.
Well, it's like there was this brief moment not long after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and when the protests erupted, that there was actually some bipartisan feeling that maybe we need to look at police reform, and things have gotten out of hand, and this was a particularly egregious case, and everyone agreed it was at that time that it was horrendous and astounding misconduct by a law enforcement officer. But then as the summer went on, President Trump sort of began to try to make the Black Lives Matter protesters and their allies into this sort of enemy of good suburban Americans. They were going to march into the suburbs and do God knows what, and they're Marxists. And so he basically made them an enemy to sort of that he could use in his own campaign. And Republicans sort of fell into lockstep with that idea and that argument. So that after the election, Republicans did very well in Iowa. I think they just basically stuck with that we need to back the blue instead of trying to help these, liberal, critical race theory, Marxist protesters. And so they went with this and dumped the racial profiling. And I think the well's been poisoned as far as, as long as Republicans here are in charge of the legislature, that we're not going to see social justice legislation or criminal justice reforms or policing reforms. I just think those divisions have been drawn, and they're no longer willing to cross over.
I know we've heard that there may be, or maybe very likely will be, a special session this year because of the redistricting that you have mentioned once we get the final census numbers. James, have you heard what other topics might come up in that special session?
Yeah, I mean, people talk about some things that could come up. One that is being talked about is a ban on transgender athletes that didn't get done during the regular session. That would prohibit transgender athletes from competing as girls in high school and college sports. However, the fact that it didn't come up during the regular session, I think suggests that there may not be broad support for it among Republicans. And we've seen some Republican governors who have come out against such a ban. I think it was the Louisiana governor this week who vetoed a ban and said that discrimination is not a Louisiana value. Who knew? But in this case, apparently it's not. Perhaps lawmakers will do something to increase COVID vaccinations, like offering lottery prizes, or I don't know, free shots for shots or something like that. But I think leaders want to keep it pretty narrowly focused, and I think probably Democratic leaders want to keep it pretty narrowly focused because if you sort of say, yeah, whatever people want to bring up, it could get pretty crazy pretty fast.
it'll be like all legislative sessions with these folks in charge. It's just a big surprise party. Who knows what they'll do? It'll come up fast and pass even faster.
The one difference this time is they are kind of on the clock with the redistricting. There are some deadlines that they have to meet, or it sort of goes on to the Supreme Court and they lose control of the process.
So shifting just to some local politics for a minute, Cedar Rapids has a competitive mayoral race shaping up. There's 3 candidates that I know of, incumbent Mayor Brad Hart, Amara Andrews, who's an executive with True North Companies and also an activist in town, and Tiffany O'Donnell, CEO of Women Lead Change and a former TV news anchor. What points of view do these different candidates represent, and do you guys think it's going to be a contentious race?
Well, it could be contentious in that it's probably going to be pretty competitive. I mean, Brad Hart's the incumbent, and he's making arguments about the good things that he accomplished and leading the city through the derecho, and the funding for flood control federal funding for flood control came under his watch. Amara Andrews has been very, very active in the social justice movement in Cedar Rapids and in the advocates for social justice who push for police reforms and a police review board. She's running a very active campaign. You can't go on Facebook or social media without seeing something she's doing or someone advocating for her candidacy. So she hit the ground running early and is running a pretty, the sort of mayoral campaign that you don't really see much in Cedar Rapids. It's more like a political campaign, which of course this is a nonpartisan office. And Tiffany O'Donnell is well known, another news anchor who is running for office. And it's going to be, I mean, as municipal elections go, not only with the mayor's race, you're going to have a renewal of the local option sales tax for streets on the ballot. You're going to have a renewal of the Lynn County gambling referendum on the ballot. Even though we don't have a casino, they can pass this referendum again, which means we're eligible to at least try for one kind of in perpetuity after this. So yeah, there's going to be a lot for voters to decide, and that doesn't even mention how many contested city council races we're going to see.
Your comment about Amara Andrews' social media campaign reminded me of a quote I read today from a national political consultant that social media doesn't pick candidates. People on Social Security pick candidates.
That's very true. And that's, we've seen that in municipal elections. Those are the folks who go out and vote because they're generally low turnout, and it's, the folks. But I mean, with those other ballot measures on the ballot this time, and also with what we saw with social activism in the city last year, there may be a little better mix of electorate than maybe we've seen in other municipal elections.
So why is it that you see all these TV anchors running for office, but no newspaper folks? Is that because people just don't like us? I mean, is that?
Well, they probably don't like us, but it's. I guess we need to get our face out there more.
Right.
Well,
we're just not good looking enough.
I'm a bad person to ask because I've spent the week getting emails from people who say I hate Iowa. So obviously that would be, something they could run against me, is that Todd Dorman's not only wrong for Iowa, but he hates Iowa.
Your backdrop says otherwise.
I know, that's what I'm trying.
Right.
We've got this is,
very supportive of the state.
This is a very large area of corn. We're probably not going to see ones this large with the drought, but we'll see.
I think it might just be that we're a little too long-winded. TV anchors can be really snappy. We're gonna give you a 900-word pitch for why we should run.
So
good
true.
Point.
So true. I wanted to hit on one last question here. The Iowa Supreme Court last week dismissed a lawsuit that sought to end kind of the state's longstanding voluntary approach to improving Iowa's water quality. Todd, this is a topic you've covered for a long time. Can you tell us about the decision and what it means for efforts to clean up rivers and lakes?
Well, in short, the Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement and Food and Water Watch. They filed a lawsuit basically alleging that the state has violated the public trust by not protecting the Raccoon River, which is a major source of drinking water for Des Moines, from protecting it from agricultural runoff, nitrates, phosphorus, all of those things that are in fertilizer and manure that's spread on fields. So the Supreme Court kind of punted. It was a fairly sharply divided decision. 4 justices, ruled that the groups didn't have standing to pursue their claim. The other 3 justices said that they thought that decision was hasty and that the groups had, should have been given their day in court to make their arguments, regardless of whether you thought they were going to win or not. So that cuts off another route to sort of force the state to better address these water quality issues. Legislature's not interested. The governor has shown some interest in filling the Natural Resources Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund, but again, it was the same model where you give farmers a lot of money to do on-farm runoff control, but you don't have to really prove that it's working. So legislature, governor, Department of Natural Resources, Environmental Protection Commission, they've all basically shown that they're okay with the status quo. So that court battle, is one more setback for folks that are trying to convince politicians and leaders and judges that the status quo is costing Iowa and destroying natural resources.
I saw that Representative Chuck Eisenhart, a Democrat from Dubuque, put out a proposal this week talking about spending some of the American Recovery Plan money on things that would bring tourists to Iowa, and including one was like the resource enhancement, and I can't think what the acronym stands for,
Yeah.
but different things like community attraction grants, things like that. And some of that money could, in theory, be used for water quality. Is this just like an unlikely thing a Democrat throws out there, or do you think there's any chance of that happening?
Well, it's probably unlikely, although, we've yet to have much of a legislative debate over how this money is going to be spent. For some reason, they've kind of decided to sit on the sidelines and let the governor make those decisions. But I do think it would be worthwhile for the legislature to maybe try to have some say. And, I don't know what the rules are for spending the money, whether outdoor recreation and some of these items that the lawmaker mentioned are eligible for that, but it's an interesting proposal.
Quad Cities area could probably use some of that funding for different things, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I would definitely think so. Yeah. One interesting, what you said, tourist environmental attractions, that got me thinking they are redoing the I-74 bridge across the Mississippi, and in several years, this is a while away, they want to redo the I-80 bridge across the Mississippi into Illinois. And there's somebody who wants to turn the old I-80 bridge into a bison roadway, so that the bison, introduce a local herd of bison, clear out an area and let them graze across this old I-80 bridge and make it a national park. So I don't know how realistic that's going to be, but it seems to be, it's garnering a lot of news coverage, even nationwide. So I don't know, it's a really interesting proposal, and I would love to have a national park personally in Iowa. So
I would definitely go see some bison. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard about that. That's a really interesting plan.
Bison on a bridge seems like a winner. Well, I usually finish up Pints and Politics with some sort of short, snappy question for our guests, but one, I couldn't think of one. And two, I want to take this minute to tell you a little bit about our in-person Pints and Politics in August. So that event is August 26th, and it's going to be at Cedar Ridge Winery. Doors are going to open at 5 p.m. and we'll go back to kind of running our show over a 90-minute period. It would start at 5:30. with a little intermission in between national and state to get another beer or a glass of wine. And past season ticket holders will get first dibs on tickets because we're only making 100 tickets available. And those tickets will be $5 each. And so those past season ticket holders should look for an email from the Gazette's events team soon. And those tickets, I think, are supposed to go on sale July 1st. And then tickets to the general public, if there's some left, we don't know for sure how that will look, will be available starting July 15th. So, hope people will jump on that so we can see folks in person. But for tonight, I want to thanks Sarah Watson of the Quad City Times for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Yeah, it's always a good time and good to see you and catch up too. And thanks also to James Lynch and Todd Dorman of the Gazette.
Thanks.
So have a great weekend, everybody, and a great upcoming 4th of July.